I'm 28 years old, and until recently, I'd been paying the mortgage on a house I bought for my parents. The idea behind buying it was simple. I wanted to provide them with a stable, comfortable place to live after everything they had done for me. But what I didn't expect was that my parents, without even consulting me, decided to give the house to my younger sister, Perry. And to make matters worse, they didn't even tell me about it. I found out in the most jarring way possible. My parents' treatment of me, especially in comparison to my sister, had always been clear. From a young age, they made it known that I was expected to take on a lot of responsibility. As the older child, I had high expectations to meet. On the other hand, Perry was always treated differently. She was the princess of the family. It wasn't that they showered her with money, but she had the freedom to pursue her passions, with little to no pressure on her academic performance. I had been the one buried in books, pushing myself to do well because I knew my parents had invested everything in my future. They had no qualms about reminding me of it constantly. It all started when I finished high school. My parents drained their savings and took out loans to pay for my technical school education. I suggested they take out a loan in my name, and I would pay it back once I landed a job. But they refused, citing the high interest rates. I was too young and naive to understand the complexities of it at the time. I trusted them when they said it was better to pay out of pocket. They never made it clear that the sacrifice was really for their own benefit. When I graduated, I landed a great job in the tech industry. It was exactly what my parents had dreamed of for me. At first, they seemed proud of me, but there was always this unspoken expectation behind their words. They would say things like, "We sacrificed so much for you," as though I owed them something in return. At first, I thought it was just a way to keep me grounded, but soon I realized it was emotional manipulation. They weren't just proud of my success, they saw it as the payoff for their investment. When I started my career, the pressure really ramped up. I would visit them, and my dad would make comments like, "Don't forget, we paid for your education. Now it's your turn to repay us." And it didn't stop there. I knew they had been saving for years for a house, but when I finally got my first job, they made it clear that I was expected to buy them a house. I was still living in a shared apartment, trying to make ends meet. I protested, telling them I wasn't even making enough to afford my own place, let alone buy them a house. But they insisted it wasn't an immediate request, just something for me to start thinking about. The pressure didn't ease off. It felt like an unspoken burden. After a few years of working hard, I eventually saved up enough to buy them a house. It wasn't extravagant, just a modest home in a quiet neighborhood. I figured it was the least I could do after everything they had sacrificed for me. I paid the mortgage for 3 years, even paying extra to pay it off early. My plan was to move on to my own life, buy a home, travel, start a family. But paying this mortgage for them wasn't part of my long-term plan. Things seemed okay for a while, but my relationship with my parents didn't improve. I kept my distance, only visiting when absolutely necessary. Then, a few days ago, I decided to surprise my parents with a visit. I hadn't seen them in months, and I was hoping for a nice family reunion. When I arrived at their house, I saw my sister's car parked outside. I thought maybe she was just visiting. To my surprise, when I knocked on the door, Perry answered in her pajamas. I greeted her, and she asked what I was doing there. I was confused. "What do you mean?" "Where are Mom and Dad?" I asked. She casually responded, "Oh, they moved. They gave me the house, so I live here now." I couldn't believe my ears. The house that I had been paying for, the house that I bought for them, had been given to my sister without a single word to me. I felt like the floor had disappeared beneath me. Perry explained that they thought she needed the house more because she was planning to have a baby soon. I asked her where Mom and Dad were living now, and she shrugged and said, "They're renting an apartment across town." I left without saying another word, my mind racing with anger. I drove straight to their new apartment. When I arrived, I didn't waste time. I marched up to the door and confronted my mom. "What the hell is going on? Perry just told me you gave her the house that I bought. Can you explain that to me?" To my shock, my mom smiled as if it wasn't a big deal. "Calm down, honey. We didn't think you'd be upset." I was furious. "How could you think I wouldn't be upset? You gave away the house I bought for you, without even telling me." She sighed, as if I was being unreasonable. "Well, We thought you wouldn't care. You're doing so well. Perry's planning to have a baby, and we thought she needed stability. Now she has the house, and she won't have to worry about rent. I exploded. I don't care where my niece grows up. This isn't my problem. It's Perry and her husband's responsibility to figure this out, not mine. At that moment, my dad came out of the room, and the argument escalated. He backed my mom, saying, "We gave you everything. You can afford to buy another house. You're successful now." I couldn't take it anymore. "I don't owe you anything. I paid off the mortgage. I bought you the house. And now you're giving it away to Perry without even telling me. How could you think I wouldn't be upset?" They kept insisting that I was ungrateful and that I should just let it go. But I couldn't. The betrayal was too much. I stormed out of their apartment, my heart heavy with anger and disappointment. I went to a hotel to cool off, unsure of what to do next. I spent the entire weekend in that hotel, just sitting with my anger and confusion. The weight of it all was overwhelming. My parents had essentially taken my efforts, my sacrifices, and used them for their own convenience. They gave away the house, the one I worked so hard to buy for them, without even consulting me. And to make matters worse, they didn't even see the problem with it. I knew I couldn't let this go. I had to take control of the situation somehow. The day after the confrontation, I decided I needed to figure out where I stood with the mortgage. I had been paying extra toward it, thinking I was ahead of the game, trying to pay it off early so I could free myself from this financial burden. I had asked my dad to check the balance, but of course, he was conveniently too busy to get back to me. So, I texted him asking to go to the bank together to get the details directly. I didn't expect much, but I needed to know the truth. The following day, we went to the bank. I was still seething with anger but kept a cool exterior. The bank manager sat us down and started explaining the mortgage balance. As I listened, my heart sank. I had been paying more than I should have, thinking it was going toward the house's balance. But when I looked at the records, it didn't add up. My extra payments, the ones I was making to pay off the mortgage early, had not gone toward the house. They were nowhere to be found. The bank's records showed that only the base mortgage payments were being made. The rest of the money, my extra contributions, wasn't there. I couldn't believe it. I turned to my dad, who sat there, acting like everything was perfectly normal. "There's a mistake," I said, my voice shaking. "Look at the payments I've been making. I've been paying almost twice the mortgage amount." But my dad didn't budge. He looked me dead in the eyes and said, "We only paid what was due on the mortgage. The rest is for our expenses." At first, I thought maybe he didn't understand. But then I realized what was happening. He wasn't confused at all. He knew exactly what he was doing. He had taken the extra money and used it to pay for their rent. All the while, I had been thinking I was making an effort to pay off the house early. "You used my extra payments for your rent?" I asked, barely able to contain my anger. My dad shrugged, acting like it was no big deal. "It's not a big deal. You sent the money, and I paid the mortgage on time. What's the problem?" I felt the world crashing down around me. I was overwhelmed by a mix of rage and betrayal. I had been living frugally, cutting back on my own needs, thinking I was doing the right thing. But all along, my parents had been taking advantage of me. The extra money that should have been used to pay off the house had been diverted to their own personal expenses. I stormed out of the bank, not caring who saw me. I couldn't look at my dad anymore. He was not the man I thought he was, and I certainly wasn't the son he wanted me to be. I was done. As I walked down the street, I could hear my dad shouting my name, but I didn't turn around. I kept walking until I reached the subway station, where I hopped on a train, still furious, still reeling from the confrontation. My mom called me multiple times that day, leaving desperate voicemails, but I didn't pick up. I couldn't. There was nothing left to say. The next few days were a blur. My emotions were all over the place. But one thing was certain. I wasn't going to keep paying the mortgage. I had already paid more than enough, and I wasn't going to let my parents keep manipulating me. The idea of cutting ties with them seemed extreme at first, but as the days passed, I realized that it was the only way forward. They had done so much damage to our relationship, and I couldn't continue to allow myself to be their financial safety net. I blocked their numbers, all of them, my parents, my sister, even her husband. I didn't want to hear from them again, not for a while. Anyway, I needed to be free of them, free of their toxic behavior, and most importantly, free of their constant guilt trips. I didn't hear from them for the next couple of days, but I knew it was only a matter of time. The moment they realized I had stopped paying, the phone calls would start. And they did. When the first day of the month rolled around, my dad tried calling, but I had already blocked him. The calls kept coming from different numbers. And each time, I just laughed. I didn't care anymore. It wasn't my problem. I wasn't going to let them manipulate me anymore. But then, just when I thought I had made my decision, my dad showed up at my door. When I opened it, I was greeted by the same angry, bitter face. He immediately started lecturing me. "You can't just leave us hanging like this," he yelled. "You owe us. We paid for your college. We made you who you are. You can't just abandon us now." I didn't even flinch. "I've paid you back more than enough," I said, voice steady. "That mortgage is more than what you spent on my education. I don't owe you anything." He called me ungrateful, but I didn't care. "You treated me like a commodity. You invested in me and expected me to give you a return. Well, that time is over. I'm not your cash cow anymore." I could see the shock in his eyes, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to let him guilt trip me into doing anything for him again. I wasn't going to let them continue using me for their own benefit. I had already made my decision, and I wasn't going to back down. I walked out, leaving him standing there. I could feel the tension rising, but I didn't want to engage in another argument. I needed space, and I wasn't going to let them drag me back into their toxic cycle. That night, my mom called me again, desperate for an answer. She left me multiple voicemails, saying things like, "Please come home. We need to talk. And you're making a mistake. Please don't do this." But I didn't listen. I didn't respond. I had made my decision, and I was sticking to it. I knew things were about to get worse, but at that moment, I didn't care. I had finally made a stand for myself, and I wasn't going to let them manipulate me anymore. No more guilt, no more pressure, no more expectations. I was done. It wasn't easy, and I knew the coming days would be filled with drama, but I felt a sense of relief. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. The next few days were quiet, almost eerily so. I stayed in my apartment, keeping to myself, away from my parents, away from the drama. I had made a firm decision to cut them off, and although it felt liberating, there was still this gnawing uncertainty in the back of my mind. I was used to being manipulated by them, to feeling guilty for things that weren't my fault. It had been a pattern for years, and breaking it was more difficult than I had imagined. A few days later, I received a message from Perry. I had blocked her number too, but she reached out through a different one. The message was simple, asking if we could talk. I didn't reply. Of course, I didn't want to get pulled into the same cycle again, but she wasn't giving up that easily. A few days after that, I found a letter waiting for me at my apartment. I almost didn't open it, but curiosity got the better of me. It was from Perry and my parents. The letter, written in her handwriting, was a long, guilt-laden message, pleading with me to understand their actions. It took me a while to read through it all. In the letter, Perry wrote about how ungrateful I was being and how much they had sacrificed for me. She even went so far as to remind me that I should have known they needed the house more than I did, especially with her planning to have a baby. My parents, she said, didn't want to ask me directly, but they felt I should understand what they needed. She tried to appeal to my sense of family, telling me that they were getting older and deserved security in their old age. I had to laugh. It was exactly what they always did, trying to make me feel guilty for doing what was right for me. They wanted me to carry the burden of their choices. And now, because they had given the house to Perry, they expected me to just roll over and fix everything. But I wasn't going to play along anymore. I didn't respond to Perry's letter, nor did I consider it for long. The truth was, I was done with them. But, of course, that didn't stop them from trying. A few days after receiving the letter, my dad showed up at my door again. This time, there was no yelling or angry confrontation. Instead, he stood there, with his usual air of entitlement, and asked if we could just talk it through. He said he didn't want things to get worse between us, and that he was sorry for how everything went down with the house. He claimed he hadn't meant to hurt me, but that they had just made a mistake, and now they needed my help to fix it. He asked me if I would consider buying them another house, telling me they deserved it after everything they had done for me. I couldn't believe my ears. After everything, after all the lies, the manipulation, and the constant guilt trips, he was asking me to do it all over again. I didn't even hesitate. I looked him straight in the eye and said, "No, I'm not going to buy you another house. You made your choice when you gave it to Perry. You can ask her to help you now." He tried to argue, saying it wasn't that simple, that they had invested so much in me, but I wasn't having it anymore. I didn't need to justify myself to him. I was done. The silence that followed was thick, but this time, it didn't feel suffocating. For once, I was the one in control of the situation, and I wasn't going to back down. A week passed, and things were quiet again. It felt strange, almost too calm. I knew they would come around eventually, but I wasn't sure what to expect next. I had already made it clear that I wouldn't be manipulated anymore, and I wasn't going to be their financial solution again. That was the last time I saw my dad. After that, he stopped calling, and I didn't hear from my mom or Perry either. That was when I decided to take control of my own life. Once and for all, it wasn't going to be about them anymore. No more feeling guilty for doing what was right for me. I'd spent so many years trying to please them, trying to make up for the sacrifices they made for me. But it was clear now that nothing I did was ever going to be enough. It wasn't about love or appreciation for me, it was about what I could give them, how I could keep filling their needs. And I was done being the one to bear the weight of their expectations. I started saving for my own future again, just as I had planned before everything went south. For the first time, I felt like I had control of my own life, without anyone else dictating it for me. My goal now was to buy my own house, one that would be mine and mine alone. I didn't need anyone's approval, and I certainly didn't need their manipulation. But as I continued saving, something surprising happened. I heard through the grapevine that my parents had sold the house at auction. It wasn't a huge shock. They couldn't afford to keep it without me paying the mortgage. And as expected, Perry couldn't contribute either. She had her own financial struggles, and she wasn't able to make the mortgage payments. In the end, the house was gone. My parents tried everything to save it, even cashing out retirement funds, but it was too late. It was sold to the bank, and that was the end of it. When I heard that, I felt a strange sense of relief. For once, it felt like they had to face the consequences of their actions. They couldn't just lean on me anymore. And that was when I realized that cutting them out of my life was the best decision I could have made. I had to let go of the past and stop trying to please people who didn't care about me in the way I needed. As the months passed, I moved on. My relationship with my parents remained strained, but I didn't let it affect me anymore. I had a new sense of purpose. I rented a small apartment for myself and started focusing on my own future. I worked hard, kept saving, and was finally on track to buy my own home. It felt like a fresh start, a new chapter in my life. I wasn't the same person I was before. I had learned to put myself first, to stop allowing others to control my life. It wasn't easy, but it was the only way to move forward. And as I approached my savings goal for the down payment on my house, I realized that this was it. This was the life I had worked for, the life I had earned on my own. No more sacrifices for anyone else. No more guilt. This house would be mine alone. I couldn't wait to make it my own. Finally, I could start living the life I wanted, without anyone else's expectations hanging over me. It was a new beginning, a fresh start, and it felt damn good. As I prepared for the final steps toward purchasing my own house, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened: the betrayal, the manipulation, the years of guilt and pressure from my parents. It hadn't been an easy journey, but I had learned a lot about myself in the process. The most important lesson was that I didn't owe anyone anything for my success except for myself. My parents, for all their talk about sacrifice, had never truly respected the sacrifices I had made for them. They saw me as a means to an end, not as a person with my own life, my own dreams, and my own choices. It had taken me a long time to realize that, but once I did, it became impossible to go back. One of the most freeing aspects of all of this was the fact that I finally had control over my own life again. For the first time in years, I felt like I was living for myself, not for my parents, not for anyone else, but for me. The idea of buying my own home, a place where I could truly start fresh, was no longer just a dream. It was within reach. I kept quiet about my plans. No one in my family knew I was in the process of purchasing a house. I didn't want to deal with their manipulations or have them somehow try to interfere in my decision-making process. I learned from my past mistakes, so I kept my goals to myself. The last thing I needed was for my parents to show up, asking me to buy them another house, or guilt-tripping me into giving up my dreams for theirs. It felt surreal. Stepping into this new chapter of my life, every penny I saved, every sacrifice I made, had led me to this moment. I had worked hard, and now I was finally about to reap the rewards of my efforts. My own home, a place where I could breathe freely, where I could start to build my life on my own terms. No more guilt trips, no more emotional manipulation. It was my time now. When the day came to sign the paperwork, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I knew this was the right move. I knew this was the fresh start I had been longing for. As I signed the papers and officially became a homeowner, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It wasn't just the house itself, it was the freedom that came with it. The freedom from my parents' toxic hold over my life, from their constant demands, and from the years of feeling like I owed them something. That night, I didn't post about my new house on social media or tell anyone about it. I didn't want to share this victory with anyone who would try to take it from me. I kept it close, shared it only with a small group of trusted friends who had been supportive of me through the whole process. It felt right to keep this moment for myself. I didn't need anyone else's validation or approval. The next few weeks were spent setting up my new place. I was excited about decorating, but at the same time, I was a little overwhelmed. I had never really had to think about decorating a space before when I lived with roommates. They handled that. When I rented places, everything was already furnished. But now, it was my turn to create a home, and I was determined not to mess it up. I scoured home decor websites, picked out furniture, and started envisioning how I wanted my space to look. It was a blank canvas, and I wanted to make it something I could truly call my own. Every corner of the house was a reflection of my journey. The choices I made, the colors I picked, the furniture I bought, all of it felt like a statement of who I had become. I wasn't the person my parents had tried to mold me into. I wasn't the son who would just keep giving and giving without receiving anything in return. I was someone who knew his worth, someone who had fought for his independence and his happiness. As I settled into my new home, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. This was my victory, my achievement. It wasn't just about the house, it was about everything that led me to this point. It was about finding my voice, setting boundaries, and reclaiming my life from the people who had tried to control it for so long. My parents didn't reach out after I moved in. They didn't ask for anything, and they didn't try to manipulate me into giving them the attention they once demanded. Maybe they finally understood that I wasn't going to give in anymore. Maybe they realized that I had learned to stand up for myself, or maybe they just didn't care enough to try. Either way, I didn't waste time thinking about it. I had my own life now, and I was going to live it on my terms. I had the space I needed to heal, to grow, and to plan for the future. My dreams were finally within reach, and I wasn't going to let anyone stand in my way. Looking back, I could see how much I had changed. I had spent so many years trying to live up to my parents' expectations, trying to make them proud, trying to be the son they wanted me to be. But in the process, I had lost myself. I had forgotten what it meant to live for myself, to follow my own path. It wasn't easy to break free from that cycle, but I did it. And now, I was finally living the life I had always wanted. I'm not sure what the future holds, but for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm in control of it. I have my own home, my own space, and most importantly, I have my own life, and that's all I need. I've learned that family doesn't always have your best interests at heart, and that sometimes you have to walk away to protect yourself. I've learned that it's okay to put yourself first, even when it feels selfish. And I've learned that I am worthy of more than being treated like a tool for someone else's gain. I don't regret cutting ties with my parents. I don't regret standing up for myself. And most of all, I don't regret buying my own house, a home where I can finally be free to live life the way I choose. It feels good to finally say, this is my life, and I'm living it for me. I believe we've reached the conclusion of this chapter in my journey. There isn't much more to say. But there are a few final reflections I want to share before closing this story. In the months that followed, I settled into my new life with a quiet peace I hadn't known before. There were no more phone calls from my parents, no more guilt-laden messages, and no more feeling like I was responsible for carrying the weight of their expectations. I had my home, my job, my friends, and my sense of self. And for the first time, I was content with what I had built for myself. I kept to myself, enjoying the newfound freedom that came with distance. I didn't feel the need to share my accomplishments or decisions with my family anymore. For a long time, I had sought their approval, but I realized I didn't need it to feel whole. I didn't owe them anything, not anymore. It wasn't just about the house, although that symbolized a significant milestone for me. It was about reclaiming my autonomy, realizing my own worth, and finally recognizing that I had the right to define my own life. The years I spent trying to meet their expectations were lost time I could have used to discover who I really was and what I truly wanted. But I had to go through that to get to this place of self-awareness and strength. I still sometimes think about my parents and the way they used to treat me. There are moments when I feel a pang of sadness, especially when I think of how things might have been different if they had only been supportive in a healthy way. But I remind myself that I have no control over their actions, only my own. Their choices were theirs to make, just as mine were mine. In some ways, I pity them. They had so much potential to nurture a loving, supportive relationship with me and Perry, but instead, they chose manipulation, control, and entitlement. They never understood that love isn't about what you can extract from someone. It's about giving them the space to be themselves, without strings attached. It took me a long time to learn that, but I am proud to have broken free. As for Perry, I still don't know what's next for her. I hear bits and pieces through family members, but I'm not involved in her life anymore. I don't hold any animosity toward her, though. I've come to understand that she's a product of the same environment I grew up in. But I'm not going to spend any more time trying to fix what's broken in her life. It's her responsibility now, just as my life is mine to manage. I won't pretend that everything is perfect now. There are still moments when the weight of my past with my parents feels heavy. There are days when I wonder if I made the right decision in cutting them off completely. But then I remind myself of what I've learned: the cost of maintaining toxic relationships is too high, and I'm not willing to pay that price anymore. So, for now, I keep moving forward. My home, my work, and the relationships I've carefully cultivated are what matter to me. I've learned that it's okay to put myself first, to honor my boundaries, and to say no when it's necessary. I'm no longer trapped in the cycle of guilt and obligation. I'm living my life on my own terms, and that's all I need. And as I look ahead, I feel a sense of excitement. There are still dreams to chase, experiences to be had, and goals to accomplish. But this time, I'm doing it for me, no one else. I've come a long way, and I'm finally at peace with the person I've become. That's the greatest gift I could give myself. And with that, this chapter of my story comes to an end. I have my home, my life, and my future. That's all that matters now.